Stephen Colbert was determined that night to tell Sylvester Stallone the truth with Comedy Central wit. The confrontation that followed forced the Hollywood legend to flee the studio in humiliation. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert's studio hummed with its characteristic blend of intellectual energy and theatrical anticipation as crew members made final adjustments for what was scheduled to be another memorable late-night interview. The sophisticated set, with its elegant blue and gold color scheme and towering backdrop of the Ed Sullivan Theater, had become synonymous with sharp political satire and incisive celebrity interviews. Tonight, however, would test the boundaries of both in ways no one could have anticipated. Stephen Colbert sat behind his iconic desk, methodically reviewing his research notes with the analytical intensity that had made him one of late-night television's most formidable intellects. His transition from Comedy Central's satirical pundit to CBS's late-night host hadn't diminished his appetite for exposing hypocrisy and challenging comfortable narratives. If anything, the broader platform had given him opportunities to apply his surgical wit to an even wider range of cultural figures. His preparation for tonight's interview had been unusually thorough. Research files lay organized across his desk, industry records, financial documents, timeline analyses of career claims, and a detailed examination of public statements spanning 5 decades. This wasn't going to be another promotional love fest designed to celebrate a Hollywood legend. This was going to be journalism disguised as entertainment, which was precisely where Stephen excelled. The production team moved with the efficiency that had become their trademark since Stephen's arrival at CBS, but there was an underlying tension in the air that experienced television professionals learned to recognize. Word had circulated that tonight's interview might venture into territory that Sylvester Stallone's representatives had specifically requested to avoid, and everyone understood that such moments could create either compelling television or complete disaster. At exactly 7:15 p.m., a silver Bentley with tinted windows pulled up to the Ed Sullivan Theater on Broadway. Sylvester Stallone emerged wearing a perfectly tailored black suit with a charcoal shirt, his appearance carefully calculated to project both Hollywood royalty and blue-collar authenticity. His signature swagger was evident as he waved to the crowd of tourists and fans who had gathered outside, though those who knew him well might have noticed a slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with certain aspects of tonight's appearance. His entourage was surprisingly modest for an actor of his stature, just a longtime publicist and a personal assistant. This streamlined approach reflected either confidence in his media skills or a desire to project the everyman image that had become central to his rocky persona. Either way, it would prove to be a critical miscalculation when facing an interviewer with Stephen's analytical capabilities. The green room provided temporary sanctuary from the controlled intensity of live television production. Stallone sat in a leather armchair, sipping espresso while scrolling through his phone with hands that still showed the muscular definition that had made him an action icon. His latest film had been receiving solid reviews, and he had grown comfortable with the rhythm of promotional interviews that focused on training regimens, career longevity, and inspirational comeback stories. 20 minutes to showtime, a production assistant announced, and Stallone felt that familiar mixture of excitement and slight apprehension that accompanied high-profile television appearances. He had done countless interviews over his career, but Stephen Colbert represented a different kind of challenge than the typical entertainment host. The man was genuinely intelligent, politically astute, and had a reputation for asking questions that could expose uncomfortable truths beneath polished public personas. His phone buzzed with an encouraging text from his team, reminding him to focus on his latest projects and avoid getting drawn into discussions about industry controversies. The message brought a confident smile to his face, reinforcing his belief that his decades of media experience would carry him through any challenging moments that might arise. The walk from the green room to the stage felt longer than usual, perhaps because he was acutely aware that he was entering the domain of one of television's most skilled interrogators. The backstage area of the Ed Sullivan Theater carried an atmosphere of serious entertainment rather than mere celebrity promotion, and the staff members he encountered seemed more focused on content creation than on making guests feel comfortable. Stephen stood to greet him as he approached the interview area, his handshake firm and his smile genuine but tinged with the intellectual curiosity that had made their previous brief encounters so memorable. "Sly, great to see you again. Thanks for doing the show." "My pleasure, Stephen," Stallone replied, his distinctive voice carrying its characteristic blend of Philadelphia grit and Hollywood polish. "Always enjoy our conversations." The pre-interview interaction was notably more substantive than Stallone's usual television experiences. Instead of casual small talk about the weather or mutual acquaintances, Stephen engaged him in a brief but pointed discussion about the current state of action filmmaking and its cultural significance. This should have been a warning sign, but Stallone's confidence in his own charisma blinded him to the intellectual trap being set. 2 minutes to live, the floor director announced, and everyone took their positions. Stallone settled into the guest chair with practiced confidence, adjusting his jacket and crossing his legs in a way that projected both authority and accessibility. His movie poster was prominently displayed on the backdrop behind them, though something about Steven's occasional glances at his research notes suggested it might not remain the focus of conversation for long. The red recording lights blinked on, and suddenly they were broadcasting live to millions of homes across America. "Welcome back to The Late Show," Steven began with his characteristic blend of warmth and intellectual authority. "I'm here with Sylvester Stallone, the legendary actor, writer, and director whose latest film is currently dominating the box office. Sly, congratulations on another successful return to the character that made you famous." "Thank you, Steven. It feels great to be back," Stallone replied, his smile genuine and his energy matching the sophisticated tone of the show. "The fans have been incredible, and I'm really proud of what we accomplished with this film." Steven leaned forward with apparent interest. "You know, it's fascinating to me how you've managed to maintain relevance across so many decades in Hollywood. Rocky came out in 1976, and here we are nearly 50 years later, still talking about these characters. That's an incredible achievement in an industry known for discarding people quickly." It was a thoughtful opening that allowed Stallone to launch into well-rehearsed reflections about perseverance, the universality of the underdog story, and his commitment to authentic storytelling. His responses were engaging and peppered with the philosophical insights that had surprised many over the years who expected only tough guy simplicity. For the first 12 minutes, everything proceeded within the comfortable parameters of prestige late-night television. Steven asked about the creative process, the physical demands of action filmmaking at an advanced age, and the cultural impact of the Rocky and Rambo franchises. The conversation was intellectually stimulating, punctuated by audience appreciation and the kind of substantive exchange that had made Steven's show essential viewing for thoughtful audiences. But then Steven's tone shifted in a way that was subtle yet unmistakable to anyone familiar with his interviewing style. His posture straightened slightly, and his questions took on the focused intensity that had made him legendary during his years as a satirical commentator. "Sly," he said, setting aside his index cards and looking directly at his guest, "I want to ask you about something that's always fascinated me about your career trajectory and the stories we tell about success in America." The slight change in approach immediately activated Stallone's defensive systems, though he maintained his composed exterior. "Sure, Steven. What's on your mind?" Steven's eyes took on the laser focus that had intimidated politicians and cultural figures alike during his Comedy Central years. "You've built your legend around this narrative of being a struggling writer who created Rocky, sold the script for almost nothing, but insisted on starring in it yourself. It's a beautiful story about artistic integrity and believing in yourself. But I'm curious about how much of that story is actually true." The question landed with surgical precision, and Stallone's carefully maintained composure flickered for just a moment before his media training kicked in. "Well, that's essentially what happened, Steven. I believed in the story and fought for the right to star in it. But that's not quite accurate, is it?" Steven pressed, his voice carrying the relentless quality that had made his political interviews so devastating. "Because the reality is that you weren't some unknown struggling writer. You had already appeared in several films, you had agents and industry connections, and the broke writer narrative was largely manufactured for publicity purposes, wasn't it?" Stallone's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of his chair, began to grip them more tightly. "I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation, Steven. Yes, I had done some work, but I was far from established." Steven's expression remained professionally curious, but his follow-up questions revealed the depth of his research. "But you weren't selling the script from a position of desperation, were you? You had multiple offers, you had leverage, and you made a calculated business decision that happened to work out brilliantly. Why perpetuate the myth of the struggling artist when the reality of a savvy businessman is equally impressive?" The studio audience, which had been enjoying the intellectual discourse, began to sense that something significant was happening. The comfortable celebrity interview was transforming into something more challenging, more substantive, and potentially more explosive. Stallone's voice carried a defensive edge as he responded. "Look, Steven, I think you're trying to diminish what was a very real struggle by focusing on technical details. The heart of the story is true. But that's exactly what I'm questioning," Steven continued, his voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had made him formidable during his years as a satirical commentator. "When we mythologize our success stories, when we edit out the advantages and connections that actually made them possible, aren't we doing a disservice to people who are actually struggling without those advantages?" Stallone's breathing had become noticeably more labored, and his Philadelphia accent became more pronounced as his stress level increased. "You're really going to sit there and psychoanalyze my life story? I thought we were here to talk about movies." Steven's expression showed what might have been genuine surprise. "We are talking about movies, Sly. We're talking about the most important movie you ever made and whether the story you've told about making it is actually true. Because if it's not, then what does that say about all the other stories?" Something inside Stallone began to crack. His voice rose just enough to be noticeable as he responded. "Other stories? What other stories? You think I've been lying about my career for 50 years? I think you've been editing," Steven replied with devastating precision. "I think you've taken a genuinely impressive story of talent and determination and turned it into a fairy tale about against-all-odds success. And I'm wondering why the real story wasn't good enough." Stallone's eyes flashed with anger. "The real story? You want the real story?" "The real story is that I worked my ass off in a town that didn't want me, fought for every opportunity, and created characters that have inspired millions of people around the world. That's the real story." "But you didn't work your ass off as a nobody from nowhere," Steven countered, his voice remaining calm despite the escalating tension. "You worked your ass off as someone with industry connections, with prior experience, with resources that most actual struggling artists don't have. And there's nothing wrong with that, unless you pretend it didn't exist." "I never pretended anything." Stallone's voice cracked with emotion. "I've always been honest about my journey." Steven leaned back slightly, studying Stallone with the same analytical intensity he had once brought to political commentary. "Have you? Because I've got documents here that show a very different timeline than the one you've been telling. I've got records of meetings, contracts, relationships that don't align with the broke, desperate writer narrative." The mention of documents sent a visible shock through Stallone's system. His face flushed red, and his hands began to tremble slightly as the implications of Steven's research became clear. "Documents?" Stallone's voice was barely above a whisper. "You've been investigating me like I'm some kind of criminal?" "I've been doing research like you're a public figure whose story has cultural significance," Steven replied with the steady authority that had made him one of television's most respected interviewers. "And when that story contains significant inaccuracies, it becomes our responsibility to address them." Stallone shot to his feet so suddenly that his chair rolled backward, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. "This is unbelievable. I came here in good faith to talk about my work, and you're attacking me with some conspiracy theory about my life." Steven remained seated, looking up at Stallone with an expression of calm professionalism that somehow made his emotional breakdown appear even more dramatic. "I'm not attacking you with conspiracy theories, Sly. I'm confronting you with documented facts that contradict your public narrative." "Facts?" Stallone's voice had risen to nearly a shout. "These aren't facts. These are carefully selected pieces of information taken out of context to make me look like a fraud." "Then provide the context," Steven challenged, his voice carrying the same intellectual authority that had made him essential viewing during election seasons. "Explain how the documented timeline of your early career aligns with the struggling artist narrative. Help us understand how both things can be true." The challenge hung in the air like a trap that Stallone couldn't escape without contradicting decades of carefully crafted public mythology. His breathing became labored as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't destroy the foundation of his cultural image. "I don't have to explain anything to you," he finally managed, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't have to justify my life to someone who's clearly determined to tear down everything I've built." Steven's expression remained sympathetic, but his words were surgical in their precision. "I'm not trying to tear down anything you've built, Sly. I'm trying to understand why you felt the need to build it on a foundation that isn't entirely solid." As Stallone grabbed his water bottle and turned toward the exit, Steven delivered what would become the most quoted line of the entire interview. "Sly," he called out, his voice carrying the intellectual authority that had made him one of America's most trusted commentators. "The thing about legends is that they have to be based on something real to be meaningful. When they're based on mythology, they eventually collapse under the weight of the truth." Stallone stopped dead in his tracks, his entire body trembling with barely contained fury. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around and physically confront Steven. Instead, he shook his head in disgust and stormed toward the exit. "You know what, Steven?" he shouted over his shoulder. "You can keep your truth. I'll keep my legacy." His footsteps echoed loudly against the theater floor as he fled, the sound amplifying in the sudden silence that had fallen over the entire space. The cameras followed him until he disappeared through the backstage door, leaving behind a quiet so complete that even the sophisticated late show audience seemed afraid to breathe. For several long moments, nobody moved. Steven sat at his desk, adjusting his glasses in a gesture that revealed, for the first time, that he wasn't as composed as he had appeared during the confrontation. The audience remained frozen, clearly processing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Finally, Stephen turned to face the camera with the intellectual honesty that had defined his career. "Well," he said, his voice carrying both regret and resolve, "that's not how I hoped that conversation would go, but it's probably how it needed to go." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "Look, I have enormous respect for what Sylvester Stallone has accomplished as a performer and a storyteller. But I also think we have a responsibility to examine the stories we tell about success, especially when those stories influence how people understand their own possibilities." The audience began to applaud, though the sound was thoughtful rather than celebratory. Stephen held up a hand to quiet them. "The question isn't whether Sylvester Stallone is talented or hardworking. He obviously is both. The question is whether we can have honest conversations about success without diminishing the genuine achievements. And apparently, we can." As the show cut to commercial, Stephen sat alone at his desk, clearly processing the intellectual and emotional weight of what had just occurred. The production team scrambled to adjust the remainder of the show, while social media began exploding with clips and analysis of the confrontation. Meanwhile, somewhere in the Ed Sullivan Theater, Sylvester Stallone was probably in a bathroom, trying to compose himself enough to face the inevitable photographers waiting outside. His minimal team was likely coordinating an emergency exit strategy while fielding calls from concerned publicists and studio executives, but the intellectual damage was irreversible. In less than 20 minutes, one of late-night television's most analytical minds had systematically deconstructed one of Hollywood's most enduring mythology. Whether you agreed with Stephen's approach or not, the conversation had exposed fundamental questions about how we construct and maintain cultural narratives, and what happens when those narratives are built on edited versions of reality. The moment would be analyzed and debated for weeks, sparking broader conversations about celebrity culture, mythmaking, and the responsibility that comes with public platforms. In an entertainment landscape that often prioritized comfort over confrontation, Stephen Colbert had demonstrated that intellectual honesty could be as powerful as any physical prowess. Whether Sylvester Stallone would ever return to address the questions raised remained to be seen. But the conversation itself had already become part of the permanent record, a reminder that sometimes the most important discussions are the ones that force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the stories we tell ourselves.